Hello and welcome to this Guardian Live event. My name is Simon Sebag-Montefiore. I've written a little bit about Russia and Ukraine myself and have just published a new book, The World, A Family History. But tonight we are here to listen to and to talk to Luke Harding, Guardian foreign correspondent, a veteran of Delhi, Moscow and Berlin. He's covered wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, Libya and Syria. He was the Guardian's Moscow bureau chief from 2007 until he was expelled by the Kremlin in 2011. On February the 24th, the night Russia invaded Ukraine, Luke was in Kiev. Invasion is his first-hand account of the conflict, from Putin's brutal assault to Ukraine's heroic resistance. It's been hailed as a superb first draft of history. I've read it myself and it's a brilliant work. And I really look forward to talking to Luke about it. Good evening, Luke. Are you there?
Simon, hello. Great to see you again.
Good to see you. Now, before I ask my first questions, we've got a lot to get through. We're going to be talking for about 40 minutes. We want to hear from you as well. So send us your questions via the Q&A button and we'll answer as many as we can in the last section, which will be the last 20 minutes of this hour. And if you like to include your name and where you're joining us from. And meanwhile, I'm going to now start asking Luke about this wonderful book, Invasion. Luke, you were there in Kiev on the first night of the invasion. The night before, you were having dinner with Andrei Kirkov, the novelist. Just tell us, A, how did you feel, when did you feel the invasion was inevitable? And B, what was it like in Kiev that night? And C, what happened the next morning? What did you see?
Yeah, well, thank you, Simon. Hello, everybody. February the 23rd. 2022. I mean, it feels a bit strange and surreal to go back 9 months to that. I mean, basically, I was one of a relatively small number of people who really believed from the beginning that Vladimir Putin was going to invade, that it was going to be a large-scale military operation. And I think I reached that conclusion based on my experience as a Moscow correspondent. I've been there for 4 years. Basically, with Putin, if there's a bad option and a worse option, always bet on the worst or the even worse than that option, because that's normally where kind of Russia and the Kremlin lands when it comes to sort of foreign policy. And so in the autumn of 2021, when Putin was sending tanks and armored vehicles and anti-aircraft systems to Belarus and to Ukraine's borders, I was convinced this was not a bluff. And interestingly, actually, most Ukrainians and actually the government of Volodymyr Zelensky himself didn't really want to accept this bitter truth, despite the fact that they were getting warnings from Washington, from London, that this operation was real, that it was imminent, that it was scary. And so I was wandering around Kiev on the night of February the 23rd, and everything was normal. I was staying in a hotel right in the center of town, not far from a Soviet replica of the medieval Golden Gate in Kiev. There was a woman outside my hotel playing Edith Piaf numbers on her violin and busking, old ladies selling tulips out of buckets. And I was late for this dinner party with Andrei Kirkov, grabbed a bottle of Odessan wine, more or less kind of legged it round to his flat and found a very agreeable company of a couple of writers, the Brazilian ambassador who had not fled, unlike most of his diplomat colleagues. And then Andrei, he's a sort of bearish guy, very bonhomous, friendly, gave me a hug, and then served me borscht, Ukrainian dish. And so we're drinking borscht, eating away, drinking honey vodka. And I mean, it was strange. I mean, I write about it in the opening chapter, but he was working on a novel where he'd got hold of the files from a dead KGB general, which were all about the interrogation records carried out by the Bolshevik secret police 100 years before, when essentially the Red Army swept into Kiev and extinguished the sort of democratic Ukrainian Republic. And it was hard to sort of think anything other than actually history was repeating itself. And Kurkov, like everyone else, he was aware that there might be a military operation, but he didn't really believe it. And I was convinced it was going to happen. And we left, we hugged again. And as I was going back, I took a call from a contact of mine who basically said the invasion would begin at 4 a.m. And I was looking up at the kind of dark velvet sky, went back to my hotel room. And of course, you don't sleep. I mean, I slept maybe 1 hour. And then half an hour later than scheduled, about 4:30, I had a call. My hotel phone rang, and it was a journalist colleague who said, "Look, it started," and there were distant explosions on the outskirts of Kiev. And finally, this thing which had been mooted, that we'd written about in opinion columns, there'd been leaders, there'd been diplomatic summits, Macron, Biden offering to meet with Putin at a superpower summit, etc. It had all been swept away, and it was clear that what was going on was, firstly, I think one of the most momentous historical events of the 21st century, of our century. And secondly, an ambitious, multi-pronged military assault designed to annihilate Ukraine's armed forces and also, I think, to exterminate Ukraine itself.
And tell us what you did the next day as the war started. Where did you go? Did you stay in Kiev? How much of the initial prongs did you see that aimed to take Kiev? And when did you realize that initial stage had failed?
Well, I mean, it was funny because to begin with, it just felt like almost like a sort of journalistic exercise. The invasion had started, must write a news story. And when the fact this was a real war, when that hit home was about 6 a.m. when a mum wandered into our kind of underground shelter with two kids who had clearly been yanked from bed. I mean, they looked exhausted, and they were holding coloring books, and she sort of sat them on a chair, on these two adult chairs, and they started coloring in. And at that point, something in me slightly kind of snapped, because I sort of realized that this was a war where civilians would suffer, where people would perish, where, as it turned out, Russia would effectively carpet bomb entire cities and kill tens of thousands of people. And some of those swept away would be soldiers, inevitably, but others would be the old, the helpless, the unlucky. And you could feel a sort of, a terrible dawning, a terrible succession after all of this sort of diplomatic language. Here was the grotesque reality. And about kind of 8:30, it was clear the explosions were far away. And I wandered out, I put my flat jacket on, I had a woolly hat, and wandered through the now pretty deserted streets of Kiev, a few people queuing at cash points. And I went to the historic center. I mean, you all know this as a historian, but I went to sort of check out St. Sophia, this 11th century Baroque cathedral. I went to the Maidan, where there'd been independence, where independence had been sort of crystallized, where there'd been anti-government protests in 2014. And it was weird. I mean, the sound of war is strange and unusual. It was very quiet. You could hear the bird song. In the playgrounds, there were no kids anymore. There were jackdaws and dogs. And I write, it was as if a million molecules had been flung violently together, because people were trying to figure out what to do. I mean, do you stay as this Russian tank column, 40 kilometers long, is traveling towards Kiev? Do you fight? Do you flee? Do you hope it will pass? And people were making existential decisions. I mean, it was an astonishing place to be. And it was clear this was a huge, terrible war.
How close do you think the Russian commandos got to killing Zelensky?
I think that was definitely the plan. I mean, the same contact who told me correctly about the invasion called me a couple of days later and said the latest plan is that the Russians are going to fly 5,000 paratroopers in. They're going to drop them into the center of Kiev. They're going to take control of all key buildings, including the presidential complex where Zelensky was staying. And he said, and by the way, get out. And this was not someone I met in a bar. This was someone who used to work in the Ukrainian foreign ministry. So who was plugged into the intelligence network. That was the plan. And the only reason it didn't happen was because, as we now know, the fight back from the Ukrainian army was much bigger, more coordinated than Moscow had been expecting. They're expecting they could more or less breeze in, mop up a little bit of Ukrainian opposition, and then within perhaps 3 or 4 days, seize Kiev, depose probably kill Zelensky or maybe arrest him and put him on a show trial in Moscow and install a puppet government. I mean, the FSB had got, the Putin spy agency had got safe houses ready. I mean, we don't know this for sure, but if and when the regime goes down, I suspect you'll find a list of cabinet posts which had already been allocated. That was the expectation. And in fact, what we saw, Simon, was the most astonishing, heroic, gritty fight back, not just from the Ukrainian armed forces, but from an entire people. And that's
when did you start to see that? What was the first time? Because this book is, I must say that this book is an amazingly sensitive portrayal of a people, of a war, of a time. It's really a superb piece of work. And I think it's more than just a sort of first draft of history. I think it's a primary source that all historians will use. It's also a work of history and really a wonderful piece of work. When did you first realize that, what was the first time you saw in the field, as it were, that the Ukrainians were really going to resist, and the West was really wrong about Ukrainian resistance?
Well, I mean, I had to kind of reconstruct it because I wasn't there. Obviously, I was sort of chronicling, this at that point, a little way away from the front line. But after the Russians failed to take Kiev, they withdrew about late March. I kind of scarpered up the road towards Chernobyl, the nuclear power station, through a landscape of pine forests, of sort of primordial bogs, with abandoned Russian tanks marked with a Z, lying sort of flamed out by the side of the road. And I sort of talked to people there, and they were saying that essentially, as the tank column went past this lumbering thing, they were secretly calling in the coordinates to the Ukrainian armed forces. And this is the mistake that Putin made. Putin thought that Ukrainians basically would welcome liberation, and that apart from a kind of thin layer of corrupt sort of pro-Western rulers led by Volodymyr Zelensky, everybody else basically wanted Russia. And in fact, the reverse was true. Nobody wanted Russia. And all of the civilian populations in villages along the route, in places like Bucha, were collaborating with their own armed forces. And what we saw was that there were Ukrainian soldiers on quad bikes, like phantoms, like partisans, who would go up this tank column in the dead of night, and they would drop little aerial bombs on the lead vehicle using drones. There were, in Bucha, one main street called Vokzalnaya, where an entire division was wiped out. Dozens of Russian vehicles were smashed up by Ukrainian artillery, which had been pinpointed to that spot. And I sort of saw that, and it was, Simon, it was like something out of Hieronymus Bosch. It was a vision of hell. That there was charred debris, tank tracks, boots, Russian Marine uniform propped up. And clearly a lot of people have been massacred there. And I think that was when the conflict really morphed into something horrible and barbarous, because that was the moment that the Russians decided that they would punish the civilian population for failing to embrace this new Russian ascendancy.
Well, we'll talk more about the fronts, as it were. But since you mentioned that now, I mean, you've been in Bucha, you've been in these other places, and this is, of course, the dark matter of war. I mean, being a war correspondent, part of it is there's some excitement in it, but there's also quite a lot of darkness. And how do you cope with that? How do you, I guess, rate your own experience as a sort of witness who's chosen to be there with the tragedies of people who weren't able to choose where they were and just happened to be in the wrong place? How do you analyze that? That's an interesting question, I think.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, to be clear, I guess to some extent it's a question about what being a foreign correspondent involves. I mean, I don't think we're the story. I mean, we're just witnesses. Our job is to go out there and report what we see. And in some ways, war reporting is the purest and most elemental form of journalism, because you're not making phone calls or talking to political sources. You simply go out and you drive through a landscape, very often, in Ukraine, shattered, ruined, ravaged. And then you talk to the survivors. I mean, you can't really talk to the dead, but I was talking to relatives of the dead in Bucha in particular in early April after the Russians withdrew. And you'll remember the photos. I mean, they haunt me still. Bodies lying by the side of the street, many with their hands tied, a man who'd been cycling around the corner when a Russian tank just shot him up and killed him. And the story I pursued was Ukrainian friends put me in touch with a woman called Tanya, who lived in Bucha and had survived the occupation, but her 26-year-old son, Volodya, he'd taken a photo of the smashed up Russian column. And then when the Russian soldiers knocked on the door and demanded he hand over his phone, they found the image. And they just said 3-4 chilling words: Ty idешь с nami, you're coming with us. And so that they dragged him off in his flip-flops in March. It was cold, just wearing a t-shirt. And the aunt, Tanya, found him about an hour and a half later in a nearby house. And she showed me, she climbed up this small apple tree, peered over a picket fence into a sort of yellow painted cottage. And there was her beloved nephew. They'd broken his arm. He was covered in blood. He was sobbing. He was saying he didn't know anything. There were military men coming and going. And later that afternoon, they stuffed him in that armored vehicle and they drove off with him and told his mother that they would bring him back again. And she then explained what happened. And what happened was that they'd never brought him back. They hid him around the corner in a little house. And we went to go and see the house, which had been shot up with daffodils in the garden, with a little well. And in one corner were brick steps leading down to a cellar. And they kept him there. And it was pitiful. I mean, we made a film about it for The Guardian. And actually, I can't watch that film anymore because there was a cuddly toy, there was a mattress, there was blood, there was a smell of death. And what happened was they kept him there for 3 or 4 days. And then, one night they came in, they made him kneel and they shot him in the head. And the point is, it was an individual horror, an individual tragedy. I mean, they showed me the grave in the garden where they buried him. It was rather a small grave. In fact, smaller than you might imagine. But this picture is being repeated, all over Ukraine. So there were 1,600 bodies of executed civilians in the Kiev region. There were dozens in Izum, where I saw a mass grave being exhumed. There are more turning up in Kherson Oblast in the south. And what's clear to me, and I don't know if you agree with this, but the Putin's project in Ukraine is essentially to get rid of Ukraine and Ukrainians. Those that can't be turned into good Russians can be destroyed. And it doesn't matter really who they are. And they've just fed into this mincer. I mean, it's horrible. You think it must be the past, but it's not. It's happening now.
Yeah. And of course, Russia today is so much the result of the way that the Russian state was formed by Peter the Great and maintained by its rulers throughout history as an empire.
I mean, actually, you write about this in your book, don't you? A World History. I mean, that you provide a sweeping work where you provide your own interpretation of Ukraine and how the past, particularly the 18th century, links to now, to what's been happening now on the European continent.
That's right. I mean, the world history has Ukraine from the time of Darius the Great's Persian invasion of Ukraine, and it ends on the Russian invasion, of Putin's invasion. So it's got a lot of Ukraine and Russia in it. But let me just go back to ask you. One of the things that is interesting about writing a history of Ukraine is to get the balance between the struggle for Ukrainian independence and nationhood, and also some of the darker episodes of Ukrainian history that happened in World War II, that the Russians no doubt exaggerate to blacken Ukraine today. And I think that the key to writing history is to write all of it unilluminated and to show everything. But let's talk about fascism and the nature of what Putinism is. We know that it's got there are aspects of it that are really old-fashioned imperialism that would have belonged in the Russia of the 18th and 19th centuries. But there's also an aspect of it that is related to fascism. What do you think about that, Luke? Do you agree with that analysis?
I do. I think that the project is fascistic, and it's really sort of fascinating. I mean, the second chapter of the book, I examine this essay, if you can call it that Putin wrote, or appears to have written and published in the summer of 2021 on the Kremlin website, which was really a blueprint for what happened next, where and it's got this rather kind of dull title on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And you read it And it's essentially a sort of highly selective, chauvinistic retelling of Ukrainian history, where he argues that Ukraine was never a thing, that it was always Russian cultural space, Russian spiritual space, and Russian language space. That the Prince Volodymyr, ruler of Kiev in the sort of 9th, 10th century, that he founded Russian civilization, and that essentially it's the fault of meddling outside powers, that the Mongols first of all, then the Poles, latterly, the West, who have divided Ukraine falsely from Russia. And so what he's doing is this sort of great epic project of historical reclamation. Now this is what he argues in the essay, but what we've actually seen with Putin sort of solemnly unveiling this war in February is a sort of kaleidoscope of different and contradictory explanations for what he's up to. I mean, first of all, it was about, as you suggest, it was about demilitarizing Ukraine and denazifying Ukraine, which it's a Soviet trope, but it's strange given the fact that Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish. At one point, the prime minister was Jewish, and most of Zelensky's relatives perished in the Holocaust. So he's a slightly unusual Nazi in that respect. And then about a month later, after the Kiev operation failed, Putin recast it as liberating the Donbass, the eastern region, Russophone region, and recently he's been talking about Satanism, purging Ukraine of satanic Western influences. So clearly it's very incoherent. And just one other quick thing, which I find amazing, is that in his essay, Putin blames Lenin for creating modern Ukraine in the 1920s, and says that essentially without Lenin, without this, Bolshevik era, there would be no Ukraine. And yet, in areas that Russia occupies, Lenin has been going back up. So in Genichess, now the Russian headquarters in the south, 122 years after he was born, Lenin is back on his pedestal again. And I have a chapter on it called "Back in the USSR," and it sort of is, but without the ideology. I mean, really, boiled down, it's an imperial war of conquest. It's quite 19th century.
But what's interesting about it, but I think one interesting thing about it is what you're really saying is there's a sort of the Satanism part of it, which is kind of related to orthodoxy and Slavophile ideas. There's the imperial narrative, which is linked to Catherine the Great and Potemkin and Peter the Great and so on. And then there's a sort of ultra nationalist, very modern sort of channeling of fascism as well. Essentially, the ideology is as incoherent as the military campaign, isn't it?
It is, and the thing is, you and I can debate it. We can define it quite precisely. We can try and fit it into a context. But I think it boils down to two themes or two coinages, and I don't know if one can swear in Guardian Light, but let's give it a go. One is great powerism. Anything that makes Russia great is good. So that can be Russian imperialism. It can be Stalin. It can be the sort of Soviet maximalism, superpowerism. That's right. And the other, I think, the other guiding principle of the Putin state is what you might call fuck youism. And essentially, his whole operation is fuck youistic. It's a big V sign to the West. It's saying you backed Ukraine, you have incubated it, you have turned it into an anti-Russian project, which is not true, by the way. It's Putin who turned it into an anti-Russian project, and so fuck you. I'm going to smash the Ukrainians, and I'm going to smash you by proxy. That's the ambition, savage and dumb and
negative.
And
negative. Based on negativity.
Based on negativity. But actually, the thing is, what I've tried to write in my book is that it's come unstuck. Actually, this overweening military assault, which was supposed to succeed, hasn't worked. There's been an extraordinary Ukrainian fight back, aided, you have to recognize, by Western military technology and precision armaments. To the point now we're in this kind of grinding conflict with the Ukrainians having the upper edge in some theaters, but at terrible cost to the civilian population, to Ukrainian soldiers who are being killed every day. And much of it, I mean, I've been to the front line, it's just hellish. It's hellish.
I mean, the front line looks often as a sort of World War I landscape of the trenches. Could you describe I know you've been in some of those trenches. Could you describe what life is like in those trenches? And then we need to get on to who's winning the war.
Yeah, I mean, earlier this month I was in Kherson province, and I was on the front line, and it's almost as if sort of there's a kind of Netflix mashup between two different dramas, because you've got First World War style trenches, and that I was sort of showed round. There were booms from artillery going on all the time, and sometimes whooshes from outgoing Ukrainian Grad missiles. And you look at the trenches, and there's a kitchen, guys eating their lunch. That there's a sleeping room with a crosshatch log roof, well constructed, a little storeroom for mortars. And you think it's all very First World War. And then I hopped out of the other side of the trench, underneath a thin line of autumnal trees, and there are three guys. It looks as if they're playing a computer game. They've got a screen and a joystick, and they're going like this. And of course, they're drone operators. Next to them, plonked in the mud, is a satellite dish connected to Elon Musk's system. And the drone operators had a drone 700 meters up in the air, and they would call in a strike. They look to see where it landed, and they showed me a puff of gray smoke. It had missed its target, and they were adjusted. And then about 10 minutes later, they hit something, either a fuel dump or a Russian tank. And then suddenly, not on screen, but in the real world, there is a huge, vast, black, phantasmagoric cloud of smoke billowing across these sunflower fields and a wintry landscape studded with Grad missiles. I mean, it's astonishing, and it's dangerous. I mean, you drive to those newly deoccupied areas, and you hear war. I mean, war is all around. I mean, war in the south is going on across the Dnieper River. I mean, the Russians have just retreated this month to the left bank of the Dnieper River, and you're worrying about something landing on your car, but you're also worrying about mines. I mean, at one point we were driving back from a frontline village, having talked to people who were, they had no electricity, they had no power, but they were joyed at being liberated. Going past a band of Russian positions, and we were very careful to stick to the road. And then, of course, the Ukrainian tank column comes towards us, and we have to pull off the road because you don't block a Ukrainian tank. That's obviously. And I'm just thinking, please God, let there be no mine, please God. And there was no mine. I mean, I'm here, but it's a landscape fraught with danger. And of course, many Ukrainian civilians are killed in the situation.
I mean, I think Isla has written, "Are you yourself safe? How safe have you been?" So, I mean, how close have you been to being killed? I mean, obviously, it's a pretty dangerous environment.
I mean, to be clear, it's dangerous first and foremost for civilians, particularly the older civilians. And one thing I've noted, having roamed all the way around Ukraine, which is a vast country, it's a huge country, very, very big. I mean, to get anywhere takes ages. It's the elderly who are very reluctant to leave their houses. I mean, they're almost limed to the spot, to the point where it's absurd. There'll be missiles raining down, and you'll see a man mowing his garden. It's sort of, hang on a minute. But yeah, I mean, we had one or two close scrapes, both in the east and more recently in the south, when I was in a village called Mala Alexandriivka to go and interview someone, and he was showing me the 5-meter crater left by a missile just across the road, which had flipped part of a tractor into his potato field. And then as we were going inside, 2 Russian rockets came screaming over our heads. I mean, basically, look, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but you do get to learn the sounds. And funnily enough, I was talking to the UK ambassador, Melinda Simmons, about this. She also knows what the sounds are. The pop, pop, pop is outgoing. That's okay. But if you hear the whistle, then you're in trouble. And if the whistle is loud, you throw yourself to the ground and you pray.
How do you cope with death that you see all the time in the streets there? How do you personally cope with it?
I mean, I think you try and limit your exposure. I mean, I went to a mass grave in Azum. Azum was liberated in September and October in a sort of stunning counteroffensive in about 5-6 days. And the city had been a major Russian garrison. The center of it had been practically wiped out. And there were about 550 people in the mass grave. And what was striking about it was the Russians had lived in the cemetery under the pine trees, and they built places for their tanks. And at one point, they had dumped the bodies of the Ukrainian soldiers they tortured and killed in a mass grave. These were all being exhumed. And and were it not for the horror, it would be quite beautiful. There are pine trees. There's a sort of sandy clearing. There's orange bark. And here are men in white boiler suits who are digging. And they pull out a body. And you look at the body and you think, is it a man? Is it a woman? Sometimes you can't tell. Sometimes you see boots and you see camouflage trousers and you realize, okay, it's a soldier. And then you're looking at the hands. Are they tied together? They're not tied together. And basically, I could do that for about 20 minutes. And then I just, it was enough to get the scene and to write a piece for The Guardian about it. And then, of course, I met someone in Izum who'd been tortured by the Russians. The only reason he was alive was because the city was liberated. He'd been in jail. The guards all ran away, the Russian guards. And he'd been electroshocked with a bag over his head, collapsed, reshocked, living in a, he showed me, living in a little cell. And it's like something out of, Dickens. So there were 3 guys in the cell and there were 3 mice that lived on the ledge, 3 men and 3 mice. They were the lucky ones. They got out, but a lot of people who are taken prisoner by the Russians don't get out.
Let me ask you a couple of questions. An audience member asks, will Putin survive this fiasco? You quote a senior Ukrainian official saying he'd be gone in a year or 2 if he invades.
Yeah. I mean, Simon, I don't know if you're a fan like I am of Armando Iannucci's Death of Stalin. And I do think
it's very historically accurate.
It is or it isn't?
It is.
It is. Okay. Well, it's also very, very blackly funny, but I do think these kind of filmic stories, which are sort of Aristotelian, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, with barriers shot in the courtyard, that they do inform our thinking. In this case, really wrongly, because first of all, there were rumors earlier this year that Putin was mortally ill. He doesn't look very good, puffy face, etc. That he was dying, cancer, something like that. I mean, he's emphatically not dead. He's still alive, so far as we can tell. And also the whole notion of a palace coup, which is beguiling. I mean, you've written about them. It's an intriguing scenario, but I just don't see it in the current power setup in Russia, unfortunately. Yes, there are people in the elite who are very unhappy about what happened in Ukraine and wish it were not so. There are rich businessmen who are devastated that they've been devisaed for Europe, that their assets have been frozen, that they've been sanctioned, and when they're in London, their bank cards no longer work. I mean, there's all that, but there's no susurration. There's no. I don't think there's going to be any kind of revolution, Russian revolution, anytime soon. Not least because this is a smart regime. I mean, they're thugs, they're murderers, they're gangsters. But for example, unlike in Stalin's times, the borders are open. So pretty much, if you don't like the regime, you can flee. So people who are educated, people who are discontented, people who might foment trouble, are now sitting in the Baltic states, in Georgia and Armenia, leaving Putin to preside over a largely docile, less educated population from whom he's mobilizing tens of thousands of soldiers. So actually, his control over Russia is pretty absolute. And moreover, I mean, I don't know if you agree with this, but I think Russia in its 2022 incarnation is as repressive, as nasty, certainly as the Brezhnev late Soviet Union. But I would say what we're seeing is a return almost to the 1930s and the NKVD, where Stalin's secret police could pluck people away in the middle of the night and get rid of them. I mean, we're not quite there, but we're not far off from totalitarianism or a form of.
Well, the difference is the numbers, of course. I mean, because in 37, they arrested many people. They executed 1 million people, basically.
But you're right. Of course, there are signal differences. Yeah. But it's kind of a smarter tyranny, if you like, because you just pick off the troublemakers, and sure. They also do it. I think generically. I mean, for example, I was kicked out of Russia in 2011, and that pour décourager les autres. I mean, then all the other foreign correspondents got the message that writing about Putin's money, as I did, what was essentially not allowed. And so you repress a few people, and actually that may be a cheaper and more effective way of repressing everybody than killing 1 million.
I think it is, but I do think that Russian revolutions are very rare, popular revolutions, and they're almost impossible when you have these massive security organizations, the security organs. So the only way it could happen, or is likely to happen, is in some sort of palace coup. But I agree, with these very cowed officials, this court of sycophants, very hard. They're all chosen for their sycophancy and for the fact that they're kind of submissive. So I agree that it's not going to happen easily.
I mean, the other thing I'm intrigued by, and I don't know what you make of this, is whether it happens to all dictators or just to Putin. But I mean, he does seem to be suffering from kind of late dictator syndrome, where he's drifted more and more away from reality. Now, how he constructs reality has always been strange. It's always been KGB. It's been conspiratorial. It's been pathologically anti-Western. It's sort of predicated on the idea of America as an unsleeping foe, just trying to encircle and destroy Russia. I mean, that's been there, but latterly, this historical avenue that he's gone down, as if he's a new Solzhenitsyn, I mean, he sort of channels Solzhenitsyn a lot. His imperialism, or neo-imperialism, his religiosity, the fact he keeps on, the patriarch, who's a KGB agent, by the way, as we know, keeps on blessing his endeavor. I mean, there's a messianic aspect to it. And you're right. I mean, he's surrounded by people who say yes all the time. And also, there's a really interesting, unwritable story about why Russia got it so wrong in Ukraine. What were his spy agencies telling him in the run-up to invasion? And actually, I had that conversation with a Ukrainian spy chief whose answer was, we have always understood the Russians better than they understand us. It's partly language. Everyone in Ukraine is bilingual. They speak Russian and Ukrainian. Russians just speak Russian. And it's partly laziness, that they just thought Ukraine was full of country bumpkins. It was a lost kingdom populated by stupid cousins. That was the sort of condescending view. And it turned out that those stupid cousins were ferociously well organized and are fighting back.
I think you're right about the fact that Putin has become weirder and more isolated as time has gone on, and that does happen to all Russian rulers that I've written about in my time. And I think one of the weird things that happens is not only do they go mad, by supreme power, by isolation, by constantly being fed the lies that they expect, but I think the very insecurity of being a Russian dictator, in a game without rules, with no system of succession, actually drives them mad and forms them and distorts their personalities. So I think he's both both someone who's developed this way organically, but also been damaged by the weirdness of Kremlin power. But let me just ask you something. Yeah, go on.
No, I was just going to say one quick thing, which is, I mean, there's an interesting conversation about whether it's actually Russia that birthed Putin or Putin that is steering Russia. And I think it's both. He's definitely a product of a warped sort of KGB inflected society. But I do the one area where I think, just quickly, the paranoia is helpful is over nuclear. There's been a lot of speculation as to whether he might unleash a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. And I think he won't, for what it's worth, primarily because his spy chiefs tell him every week that they've foiled 3 plots by the American special services to kill him. And so his head he believes the Americans are trying to kill him all the time. And therefore, I think that's what holds him back, because ultimately he's a bit of a coward, is that he thinks that if he drops a nuclear bomb, the Americans will take him out. And the one thing he cares about, I think, more than anything else, is his personal survival.
Let's talk about the end game now, because we've got time is flying. An audience member asked, do you see an end to the war through negotiations, or do you think the only possible end is Russia's complete withdrawal? Can Ukraine do this, or will they be forced to give up some of their territory in exchange for a ceasefire?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a pregnant question. It's a now question, because there've been sort of murmurings reported out from Washington that the US maybe. I mean, we have to acknowledge the Biden administration has given almost $20 billion in military and economic assistance to Ukraine, without which it would have fallen. So the American intervention has been crucial, but sort of pragmatic voices saying, look, you're going to have to compromise, maybe cede territory in the south and the east, have a negotiated settlement, and this infuriates ordinary Ukrainians, and it infuriates the government of Volodymyr Zelensky. I mean, for two reasons. There's a kind of analytical reason, which is they say, I think very plausibly, that were there to be a peace deal, the Russians would simply use that to regather, to consolidate, to bump up their armed forces, to maybe buy missiles from North Korea, to replenish their stocks, and then attack again, essentially. And basically, Putin cannot be trusted, and that much is true. I mean, he lies all the time. Sure. He negotiates in poor faith. So a peace deal probably wouldn't work. But also, the other point is they have suffered so much. So many people have been killed. We're talking 400 kids, tens of thousands of civilians, huge areas, absolutely wrecked. I mean, Mariupol, a city I visited in January of almost 500,000 people, now just a smoldering ruin. And so they cannot compromise. I mean, Zelensky's clear that he wants to deoccupy everything. He wants Crimea back. He wants the East back. I mean, how realistic that is, I don't know. But their ambition is everything. And I think the war ends either with a complete Ukrainian military victory or with some kind of power shift in Moscow, not to a more liberal regime, but something happens there. It's quite, I mean, you think nothing is happening, and then suddenly 2 days ago, Belarus's foreign minister dropped dead in mysterious circumstances. I mean, people in this world.
I've got a question about that here. I've got a question about this. Sorry, but the death of the foreign minister in Belarus is pretty fascinating. There's obviously a lot of wet work going on behind the scenes here. But somebody here, Hannah in Vilnius, not far away, asks, what do you think of the current relationship between Putin and Lukashenko? And I would add, sort of, do you think he's going to fully enter the war? Do you think he's capable of entering the war?
I mean, I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge what Belarus is doing. And what Belarus is doing is facilitating attacks on civilians, facilitating the murder of Ukrainians. And it's been used as a sort of staging platform for the whole invasion. I mean, Russian troops swung in from Belarus. So Lukashenko is a co-party to this war. I think the reason he hasn't sent his own troops in is that he's fearful as to what the West might do. And also, I suspect that the Belarus armed forces don't really want to fight, actually, and moreover, will probably be wiped out pretty quickly.
They must be absolutely useless compared to the Russian ones, who also turned out to be pretty useless.
Pretty useless,
low level.
But one prediction I would make, and this is a sort of fantasy scenario, but let's say that Putin goes. I don't quite know how or when. I mean, I think we're reaching the end of Putin, but when I think we're in Act 5. Shakespeare play Act 5, but when the denouement comes, I don't know. But if Putin goes, if he is removed, especially if it's any kind of uprising, then Lukashenko would be pretty immediately swept away as well, because he's deeply, deeply unpopular and just a savage throwback dictator of the worst kind.
I've got so many questions here. Fiona from Hertfordshire asks, I'm really intrigued to know what you make of Zelensky.
Oh gosh, I mean, I have a whole chapter on Zelensky called Servant of the People, and it's a very good. I spent a lot of time thinking about Zelensky. I mean, not least because I covered his campaign in 2019, at a time when Ukraine was not so much on the radar, and there are several ironies here. One is that he ran on a peace ticket in 2019 against the hawkish incumbent president Petro Poroshenko, who was seen as more of a kind of nationalist, anti-Putin figure, because Zelensky basically said, "I will make peace with Putin. I will bring this war to a close," and also, just before the invasion, his popularity ratings were sinking. They were going down. And what we've seen is perhaps the greatest transformation of the century of a leader from a civilian leader into a war leader. And I quote Arissia Lutsevich, who's a very good analyst at Chatham House, who talks about Zelensky as metamorphosis Zelensky. And in other words, if you've got a normal politician, let's say someone like Matt Hancock, who's in a suit and then goes to the jungle and pretends to be, I don't know, a survivalist. Mm-hmm. We all laugh at him because it's risible. But the thing about Zelensky is he's been on Ukrainian TV screens wearing different costumes. He won Dancing with the Stars, their Strictly Come Dancing in its first series. I mean, he dresses up as this, dresses up as that. And immediately the war starts. And he's popping up in the costume of a civilian volunteer, green khaki T-shirt, serious, beard, For me, I think that probably the most important moment of the war was on day 3, when I can tell you, I was in Kiev. There was a mood of absolute fear and dread. The Russians were coming. People thought it was all over, that the government was finished, that they were just fleeing as best they could. Not everybody, many people. The streets out were jammed. And Zelensky just turns up outside his presidential palace. He holds his mobile phone to him and he looks into the camera and he just says, Yatut, Yatut, I'm here, I'm here. And the Russians thought he would run. I think probably the Americans thought he would run as well. He didn't run. He still hasn't run. I'm told, I know his speechwriter pretty well, that he's not going to leave the country until the war is over. And he's a commander in chief, but he's also an amplifier in chief. He has taken Ukraine's message of struggle and the fact that this is not their struggle, but it's our struggle. It's a struggle for humanity. It's a struggle for decency. It's a struggle for democracy, for the right to self-determination. He's taking it to national parliaments around the world, and you know, he's beamed into rock festivals. I mean, he's everywhere. And yeah, I mean, the speeches, they're not entirely original, but they hit the spot. And if you think about his address to the British Parliament, I mean, I've watched it a few times, and this was on day 13 when it looked like Ukraine was finished. And he just said, channeling Churchill, you know, we will fight them on the beaches. And then he added, he sort of Ukrainized it, we will fight them in the forests. We will fight them on the slag heaps, referencing the east of Ukraine. We will fight them on the Kalmius, which is the river that runs through Mariupol. We will never surrender. And then he talked about, I mean, it sounds better in Ukrainian, but he talked about Great Britain, which is Veliki, Velika Britannia. And then he talked about, Great Ukraine, Velika Ukraina. And it was almost like a magical incantation binding the two nations. And one thing his speechwriter told me is that he likes poetry. He likes poetry. You can see that there's a rhythm, there's a cadence, there's a love of language. And funny enough, I think metaphor and the fact that his team are all showrunners, they understand TV in the modern world, the fact that they use MacBooks, iPhones, that has absolutely helped in sending out Ukraine's message to the world.
Yeah, I mean, he's as much a master of the sort of our sort of the internet world, the digital world, as Churchill was of radio. And I think, that speech, we are here, it's got to be the greatest speech of the 21st century. It's only about 3 words. But let me ask more questions.
Sure.
Rosalind from Provence in France, we've got lots of international questions here, says, have you been or felt personally targeted by Russia, either by being spied on or physically threatened? And let me also just add in a couple more of these, if you can remember them, Luke. Martin says, what's the morale like among Ukrainian soldiers and population in the fighting zones? And Michael says, what's the biggest error the West has made? So those are 3 questions. I'm just asking because they're
I'll try. I mean, they're all super questions. I'll try and rattle through them. I mean, targeted. I wrote a book in which, after I got kicked out of Russia, called Mafia State, which sort of chronicled, I would say, minor harassment at the hands of the FSB, Putin's spy agency. But in short, they broke into our family apartment and bugged us, said we were bugged. They left stupid clues that any idiot could find, which were demonstrative and designed to intimidate us. I was sort of deported from the country in 2011. And then this summer, I mean, actually, Simon, I'm disappointed I don't think you're on it, but I was put on an official list by the Russian Foreign Ministry of people who are undesirable and not allowed.
I'm very hurt to be left off. I'm very hurt to be left off.
You're probably on the next one. In terms of morale, on the Ukrainian side, it's pretty high. It's pretty high. I mean, especially these 2 counteroffensives and the recapture of Kherson, which was the only regional administration capital that the Russians held. I mean, they've lost it. I mean, they're now bombing it and they're killing people every day, and it's appalling. But the Ukrainians, their sense of momentum is with them. And you ask them why they're fighting. You ask a Ukrainian soldier, and they all give the same answer. They say, "I'm fighting for my family, for my kids, for their future, for my village, for my country." And basically, if we don't fight, we will be subjugated and we'll become slaves. That's what they say. So unlike the Russians, they know why they're there. And sorry, remind me of the third question.
Third question is, what's the biggest? This is a good question. What's the biggest error the West has made, or has the West made a big error?
Yeah,
I guess
the West has made some colossal errors, and basically it's been too late. I mean, what Putin has done over 2 decades is a series of egregious deeds, and he's been waiting for the response to come, and really there's been not much. So we're talking about the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, about whom I wrote a book, A Very Expensive Poison, in 2006. We're talking about the war in Georgia, which Putin invaded in 2008. Next door, we're talking about his annexation of Crimea, for which there were very few consequences, and the fact that he actually started this war in Ukraine 8 years ago in the east of the country. Sergei Skripal, again, the tourists sent to Salisbury Cathedral to kill him. And it's only when he's actually begun Europe's biggest armed conflict for 80 years that I think everybody in the democratic world has realized this is a rogue regime. I mean, Zelensky calls it a terrorist state. And Mrs. Zelensky was in London today, basically promulgating that message. It's hard to disagree when so many civilians have been deliberately and wantonly killed. So yeah, I mean, basically we should have done more earlier. And just one final thing on that is that, there's been quite a lot of finger pointing at the Germans for becoming addicted to Russian gas, to the point where actually that was clearly a major strategic error by successive German governments. Well, in the UK, I'm afraid we've become addicted to Russian money. And since the 1990s onwards, but certainly over the last 10 years, there have been huge amounts which have flooded here with wealthy Russians able to buy British passports, no questions asked, and still with Russian-linked donations going into the Conservative Party. That's the problem, not least because it confirms Putin's view that anybody can be bought. Any politician can be co-opted or procured if the price is right. So, we get it now, but we could have got it earlier.
Let me ask you a question about the peace deal, which I think is important. I mean, Crimea is, I'd suggest, sort of essential to Putin's presidency now, and obviously Zelensky says he wants it back. I mean, how serious are the Ukrainians about getting back Ukraine, and militarily, how close are they to being able to do that?
Well, I mean, politically, they're absolutely serious. They want Crimea back, and bear in mind that the Tatar population, the sort of Turkic Muslim minority that lived there, under Ottoman times, were the majority population, have been persecuted for centuries, were deported en masse by Stalin, came back 30 years ago, have now been re-persecuted by Putin. I mean, there were plenty of people. I mean, not so much in Sevastopol, the main port, but which had been heavily Russified, but elsewhere who were pro-Ukrainian. Now, how much of a welcoming constituency would be there if Ukraine comes back? I don't know, but they're serious about its return. How possible that is, how realistic, I don't know. I think it would be very hard. But what's been interesting have been these audacious Ukrainian military operations to target Crimea, which Putin has frankly turned into a garrison. It's a fortress. So we've seen the Crimean bridge to the Russian mainland being mysteriously blown up. And most spectacularly, I mean, I don't know if you saw the video, Simon, but we've seen these sea drones, indigenously developed Ukrainian sea drones.
Amazing.
And basically what they are, this is not a secret anymore, it's a jet ski with a satellite navigation system and a whole load of TNT on the front. And there's video of this sea drone, like something out of James Bond, zipping through the harbor with bullets firing into the water and blowing up a Russian frigate. And so you sort of think, Crimea is impossible. But at the same time, who would underestimate the Ukrainians and their determination? And also, stand by for further surprises.
When you were there, one thing I always wanted to ask, I've got a couple more questions here, but one thing I always wanted to ask is, did you see, it must be a lot of American and British special forces and advisors around Ukraine. Did you come across any?
I didn't. I mean, it's not that I have a sign saying I'm a Guardian reporter and they all kind of, slunk into the shadows. I didn't. I mean, I'm not saying
a lot.
I'm not saying they're not there. I mean, they may be there, but the people I did meet I met a lot of paramedics, actually a couple of British paramedics. I met a Russian paramedic on the front line in the northeast, near a town called Kupinsk, which was very badly shot up. And so there are plenty of civilian volunteers. I mean, there is an international legion. There's also a small but interesting Russian legion of anti-Putin people who are fighting against Russian troops on the Ukrainian side.
And a Chechen legion.
And there's a Chechen leader as well. I mean, how big they are, how significant they are, I don't know. But what we shouldn't do is we shouldn't overstate it. I mean, Russian propaganda says, they are fighting Western mercenaries and American snipers. That they're obsessed with Black American snipers. And actually, look, I didn't see any Black American snipers. What I saw were hundreds of volunteers, particularly in the early part of the war, who came back from abroad. And it was just terrifically moving. They would gather outside a military commissariat every morning, often wearing baseball caps and civilian clothes. And they were then taken off for 2 weeks training and sent to the front line. And I was looking at these young men, and you look at 30 of them, and you can immediately say that 5, 8, 10 will probably not come back. And they were not soldiers or something out of a film. They were IT guys. They were builders. They were people with parents living in America, Ukrainian Americans who'd come back to fight. And ultimately, what Putin is dealing with is an incredibly networked, horizontal society. I mean, the wonderful thing about Ukrainians is that they're not Russians. They're not feudally minded. They're slightly anarchistic. They're creative. I mean, they're rather cool. Kiev is a very cool capital. And when there's peace, I urge everyone to go there. It's a beautiful, wonderful place. And, I do think that they will, sooner or later, they'll prevail.
But we're just counting down here just to the end of this. So I just want to ask you something. I want you to answer very quickly.
Sorry.
But these are incredibly unfair questions, which I'm going to ask you. How long do you think this is going to continue for?
Certainly into next year. I would say the summer and probably well beyond.
Is it actually going to end? I mean, the Ukrainians, depends what you mean by the Ukrainians prevailing. But, is there quite a likelihood this is just going to grind down into a sort of stalemate that will lead to negotiations?
Well, I would expect Ukraine to make further territorial gains next year, but I would not expect them to deoccupy everything. And I think Crimea, maybe a step too far. But I also think, who am I to tell the Ukrainians what to do? They have to decide their own future and destiny. If they want to fight on, we should support them.
Do you think the Russians are going to somehow try and spread this to other countries? Obviously not NATO countries, but other countries. I mean, do you think it could escalate?
That was definitely the plan. I mean, I think if they'd wrapped up Ukraine, they would have kept going. I mean, the obvious next target was Moldova and Transnistria, which is an unredeemed slip of sort of Soviet gangster territory. It's formerly part of Moldova, but essentially the Russian army is stationed there. And it's west of Odessa. They definitely wanted that. And they've been making rumblings about Kaliningrad, the exclave, near the Baltics. And I think they would quite like to seize that too. So I think it's only military defeat which will stop the Russian machine from rolling further on.
Right. And do you see Putin leaving this alive? Leaving power alive? I mean, I know these are impossible questions, which is why I'm asking.
Okay, so I would say no. I think the most likely scenario with Putin, I mean, how he ends his days, whether it's naturally like Stalin, whether it's unnaturally like Belarus's foreign minister, I think the most likely scenario for Putin exiting power is horizontally Brezhnev style in a coffin.
Yeah, so not alive. And just finish, let me just finish on a very personal note before we finish this up. Just give me what is it like seeing this in terms of your life, your trajectory, your experience?
It's a privilege. What I tried to tell in this book was obviously the backstory, the history, the geopolitics, but the kind of human dimension, and to actually meet people in the situation, to talk to them, whether the relatives of people who've been executed, or soldiers fighting on the front line, or civilians living under shelling and daily bombardment. I mean, it's humbling, and it's a privilege to have a front row seat on history. And I just want to get those stories out.
You've done that.
And in my writing,
you've done that beautifully.
And because and this is my sort of final word, because I think there is a danger of Ukraine fatigue setting in, that we get bored. I mean, as you say, the conflict grinds on and we change the channel, or we stop thinking about it. And I think, bear in mind the scale of this conflict, 1 million people on arms, bombs, missiles, rocking Europe. It's our continent, for most of us living in Europe who are watching this. And I think Ukraine deserves our continued support and also our empathy. I make a plea for empathy.
Thank you, Luke. And with your book, that is achieved. It's just a superb book, really a brilliant book. I think everyone should read it. Let me say, sadly, we've run out of time, but I hope we were able to answer some of your questions. Thank you for joining us tonight. If you don't have a copy of Invasion, or indeed of my book, The World, A Family History, they're out now. We'll put a link in the Q&A box. Author royalties from the sales of this edition will go to the Disasters Emergency Committee's Ukrainian Humanitarian Appeal. Guardian Live have much more coming up. To find out more, visit theguardian.com/Guardian Live. And let me just say, we'd love to hear what you think of this event. Finally, a huge thanks to you, Luke Harding. Congratulations on the book. It's a superb and must read. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, everybody. Slava Ukraini.
Slava Ukraini. Good night.